The illusion of direct conflict. You think strength means confronting, but most damage is done without confrontation. The instinct to respond, to defend, or to prove something in the moment feels natural. It gives a sense of control, a feeling that you are standing your ground. But what often goes unnoticed is that direct conflict exposes more than it protects. It reveals your position, your emotions, and your intentions, all at once. And once those are visible, they can be anticipated, countered, or even manipulated without you realizing it. What most people miss is that the most effective individuals rarely oppose directly. They don't rely on reaction as their primary mode of engagement. Instead, they shift conditions. They observe patterns, understand dynamics, and make adjustments that influence outcomes without creating visible resistance. This is not about avoidance, it is about precision. It is the ability to recognize that not every situation requires your presence in the form of action or words. Sometimes, the most impactful move is the one that is not seen. There is an emotional tension that sits beneath this understanding. The urge to respond is often tied to identity. You want to be perceived as capable, as strong, as someone who cannot be challenged without consequence. And when that perception feels threatened, reaction becomes almost automatic. But in that moment, control begins to shift. You are no longer operating from clarity, you are operating from impulse. And impulse, even when it feels justified, is predictable. Direct conflict creates a clear line of engagement. It turns a situation into something visible, defined, and measurable. But visibility is not always an advantage. When everything is on the surface, it becomes easier for others to respond in equally direct ways. The interaction becomes reactive on both sides, and the outcome often depends on who can sustain that reaction longer. This is where most people lose, not because they lack ability, but because they are drawn into a pattern that drains focus and creates unnecessary exposure. The psychological realization begins when you start to see conflict not as something to win, but as something to understand. Every situation carries underlying structurous motivations, perceptions, expectations that shape how people behave. When you react immediately, you bypass that structure. You engage with the surface, not the foundation. But when you step back, even briefly, you begin to see what is actually influencing the interaction. You notice where tension originates, where it is directed, and how it evolves over time. This shift changes how you approach pressure. Instead of moving toward confrontation, you begin to move toward positioning. You adjust your responses, your timing, and even your presence in ways that alter the dynamic without escalating it. You stop feeding situations with unnecessary energy. You allow certain tensions to exist without intervening, knowing that not all conflicts require resolution through action. Some resolve themselves when they are not reinforced. The mindset begins to move away from proving strength and toward maintaining control. You realize that reacting may satisfy an immediate impulse, but it often weakens your long-term position. Silence, observation, and deliberate restraint create space to understand, to decide, and to act only when it aligns with your direction. And in that space, your behavior becomes less predictable, more controlled, and significantly more effective. As this becomes consistent, your identity begins to shift. You are no longer someone who needs to engage with every challenge. You become someone who understands that control is not demonstrated through confrontation, but through the ability to remain unaffected by it. Power moves without being seen. Influence is strongest when it is not noticed. Most people associate power with visibility, being heard, being acknowledged, being clearly understood. But visible influence often invites resistance. The moment people recognize that something is being directed at them, they begin to defend, question, or push back. What appears as strength on the surface can actually limit effectiveness, because it triggers awareness in others. And once awareness is activated, opposition naturally follows. What remains largely unseen is how often outcomes are shaped without direct confrontation or recognition. The most effective shifts happen quietly through timing, positioning, and subtle behavioral changes that alter the environment without drawing attention. These changes are not dramatic, they are not announced, but they influence how situations unfold. And because they are not perceived as threats, they move without resistance. There is a social pattern here that most people overlook. Human behavior tends to respond to what is visible and immediate. People react to words, to actions, to direct signals, but they rarely notice what is absent. They don't always detect what has been removed, delayed, or subtly redirected. This creates a space where influence can exist without being challenged. not because it is hidden in a deceptive way, but because it operates outside the usual focus of attention. When you understand this, your approach begins to change. You stop trying to impose outcomes through force or argument. Instead, you begin to shape the conditions that lead to those outcomes. This might involve stepping back at the right moment, allowing others to move in a certain direction, or simply not engaging in ways that reinforce patterns you no longer want to be part of. These decisions are not reactive, are deliberate. And because they are not obvious, they are rarely questioned. There is an important distinction here between control and clarity. Control, in the conventional sense, often involves direct intervention. It seeks to manage behavior through visible means. But clarity operates differently. It allows you to see how dynamics unfold without needing to interfere constantly. And from that clarity, you can make small adjustments that have a disproportionate impact over time. You are not forcing change, you are allowing it to emerge under conditions you understand. The leverage point lies in your ability to remain unnoticed in your influence. When people do not feel directed, they behave more naturally. They reveal more. They follow patterns that are easier to observe and anticipate. This gives you a form of awareness that is difficult to access when interactions are direct and reactive. You begin to understand not just what people do, but how they move when they are not being influenced overtly. As this awareness develops, your mindset shifts away from visibility. You no longer feel the need to demonstrate your influence or prove your impact. You become more selective in how and when you engage. You recognize that not every situation requires your input to be effective. In many cases, restraint creates more movement than action. This leads to a different kind of presence, one that is not defined by what you say or how strongly you assert yourself, but by how consistently outcomes align with your direction. And because this alignment is achieved without drawing attention, it remains stable. It does not depend on others recognizing it, agreeing with it, or even understanding it. Over time, this shapes your identity. You become someone who does not need to be seen to be effective. Someone who understands that influence does not always announce itself, and that the most controlled movements are often the ones that pass unnoticed. Discipline removes the need for reaction. The moment you react emotionally, you give others influence over you. It doesn't feel like that in the moment. It feels justified, even necessary. Something is said, something happens, and your response comes quickly, almost automatically. But what is rarely noticed is that this reaction is not entirely yours. It is shaped by the situation, by the other person, by the tension that was created. And once your behavior is shaped externally, even slightly, your control begins to weaken. There is an internal conflict at the center of this. You want to remain composed, but part of you feels pulled to respond, to correct, to defend, to assert. That pull is not just emotional, it is tied to identity. You want to be seen a certain way. You want to maintain a sense of position. And when that position feels challenged, reaction becomes a way to restore it. But in doing so, you reveal more than you intend. You show where you are affected, what matters to you, and how easily your state can be influenced. What most people overlook is that discipline, in this context, is not about suppressing emotion, it is about creating space between stimulus and response. That space is where control exists. Without it, behavior becomes predictable. You feel something, and you act on it. Others begin to understand that pattern, and over time, it becomes easier for them to anticipate how you will respond. Not because they are controlling you directly, but because your reactions follow a consistent structure. Discipline interrupts that structure. When you begin to observe your reactions instead of immediately acting on them, something shifts. You notice the impulse before the action. You recognize the tension before the response. And in that moment, you have a choice not to eliminate the emotion, but to decide whether it deserves expression. This decision is quiet. It is internal, but it changes the entire dynamic. Emotional control, then, is not about becoming distant or unresponsive. It is about being selective. Not every situation requires your reaction. Not every comment requires your attention. And not every challenge requires your engagement. The ability to recognize this creates a form of stability that is difficult to disrupt because it is not dependent on what is happening externally. This is where mental boundaries begin to take shape. You start to define what you allow into your focus and what you leave untouched. You stop giving equal weight to everything that occurs around you. Instead, you prioritize what aligns with your direction and quietly disregard what does not. This is not avoidance, it is clarity. It is the understanding that your attention is limited, and where you place it determines the quality of your decisions. As this becomes consistent, your behavior changes in ways that are not immediately obvious, but deeply impactful. You speak less in moments of tension. You pause before responding. You allow situations to unfold without needing to intervene instantly. And because of this, you become less predictable. Others cannot easily determine how you will react, because your reactions are no longer automatic. This unpredictability is not chaotic, it is controlled. It comes from a place of awareness, not impulse. And it shifts how others interact with you. When people realize that you are not easily provoked, that your responses are measured rather than immediate, the dynamic changes. The usual triggers lose their effect. The patterns that once shaped your behavior begin to dissolve. Over time, this leads to a deeper transformation. You are no longer navigating situations based on how they make you feel in the moment. You are navigating based on what aligns with your long-term direction. Emotions are still present, but they are no longer in control. They inform, but they do not decide. And in that shift, you move from being influenced by external pressure to maintaining internal stability, regardless of what surrounds you. Silent detachment creates untouchable authority. There comes a point where others can no longer provoke a reaction from you. Not because situations have become easier, but because your relationship with them has changed. What once triggered immediate response now passes through you without disturbance. You notice it, you understand it, but you are no longer pulled into it. And this shift does not come from effort alone, it comes from detachment. Most people misunderstand detachment as distance or indifference. They assume it means withdrawing from people or avoiding engagement. But true detachment is not about separation, it is about independence from outcome. It is the ability to move through interactions without needing them to resolve in a certain way. You no longer rely on others' behavior to feel stable, understood, or in control. And because of that, their actions lose the ability to shape your internal state. What is rarely noticed is how much of human behavior is driven by reaction. People speak to provoke, act to elicit response, and test boundaries to see where influence exists. When those patterns meet resistance, they often intensify. But when they meet silence genuine, unforced silence begin to reveal themselves. Not immediately, but gradually. Without reaction, there is nothing to push against. And in that absence, patterns that were once hidden become visible. This is where awareness deepens. When you are not reacting, you are observing. You are not focused on defending your position or correcting someone else's. You are focused on understanding what is unfolding. You notice repetition, inconsistency, timing. You begin to see how people behave when they are not being met with the expected response. And this observation gives you clarity not just about them, but about the dynamic itself. Inner authority begins to take shape in this space. You are no longer negotiating your state with the environment around you. You are not adjusting your behavior to maintain approval or avoid discomfort. Your decisions come from a stable internal reference, not from external pressure. This does not make you rigid, it makes you grounded. You can engage when necessary, step back when appropriate, and remain unchanged by fluctuations that once would have influenced you. There is a long-term effect to this kind of detachment. You become consistent in a way that is not dependent on circumstance. Your direction remains steady, even when others shift. And over time, this consistency creates a form of quiet authority. Not something you claim or display, but something that is recognized through your behavior. People begin to understand that your responses are not easily influenced, and that changes how they approach you. This is not about controlling others. It is about removing the need to. When you are no longer reacting, you are no longer participating in unnecessary cycles. You are not feeding conflict, not reinforcing patterns, not giving energy where it does not serve you. And in that absence, many situations resolve themselves. Not because you forced them to, but because you did not sustain them. As this becomes part of how you move, your identity consolidates. You are no longer defined by how you respond under pressure, but by your ability to remain unaffected by it. You do not need to prove control, you embody it. You do not need to demonstrate strength, you operate from it. And when you reach that level, nothing around you needs to be controlled because nothing within you can be moved.